Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark. Today, joining Diana is Dr. Fink. Dr. Fink is a child, adolescent, and sports psychiatrist in private practice for the last 36 years in Houston. He is on the advisory board of the Council on Recovery and is also a founding advisory board member of their Center for Co-Occurring Disorders. Dr. Fink is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine, as well as at McGovern Medical School. Diana and Dr. Fink, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. And welcome, Dr. Fink. I really appreciate you taking the time out of what sounds like a very busy life to talk with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. My pleasure.
So the subject we're going to be talking about is the biopsychosocial model of psychiatry. And it's a big word, so I want to know, what does that encompass? I have an idea, but I'd love to hear it from an expert.
Sure. It was originally proposed by a psychiatrist, David Engel, a number of years ago, probably way before I went into practice. But it's really the idea of integrating biological aspects, things like genetics, physical illness, being aware of those things, how they influence the person, psychological, integrating kind of thoughts like intrapsychic processes, learning theory, those kinds of things, and social, recognizing that we all live in an environment that's influenced by family, culture, those kinds of things, and realizing that all those aspects come together to influence a person's being.
That's right. I mean, and before this model, what did it look like? Because that makes so much sense.
I think the contrasting model, if you will, is one that tends to try to think of things as either physical, biological, or psychological, and really sort of doesn't yes, it's sort of, you either have a brain or you have a mind, and not realizing that the mind is part of the brain, and that all those things are influenced by the environment that we live in and that we grew up in. And so I really like to talk about a developmental biopsychosocial model, really realizing that how we are as a person changes over time. So it's not even a static model.
So it's not even a fixed personality at that point.
Right.
So let's I know one of your specialties is ADHD, and you work with eating disorders and substance use disorders if you're working for the Council on Recovery or working in that organization. Let's take a 16-year-old who comes in, two parents, one of whom has a substance use disorder that is currently in recovery. And the 16-year-old comes in and says, basically, what are you going to do? Right? I mean, that's the question I get from a 16-year-old. What are you going to do? Yeah.
Yeah. And I always, the way I do evaluations with adolescents is I typically start the evaluation with meeting with them and their parents at the same time, and really start by asking, what are your concerns? And, just explain it to me briefly so that I can sort of have an overview. And whoever wants to go first can go first. And that, to me, is part of the initial evaluation, is seeing who speaks up, who defers to who, those kinds of data. And it's important data. So I'll look at that. My experience is either the adolescent typically will go first, or they'll go last. If they go last, it's usually because they're there because they're not wanting to be there. And I changed my wording a little bit. I said, what, if anything, are you hoping to accomplish by being here other than getting out of here?
And what, if anything? Yeah.
And
so parents off my back. That's a legitimate, right?
And so I then, based on the initial information, I will then gather some history about kind of the presenting problems, what are their concerns, each of their perspectives of those concerns. I'll then go into background information, basic medical history, those kinds of things. I'll try to get some, if we're talking about ADHD kind of concerns, I'll get a history based about what's going on in school,
Right.
those kinds of things. And then I'll also screen really to see if they have other problems that may be contributing to their inattention. Things like anxiety, things like depression. Are there substance abuse issues for the adolescent? Because we do know that individuals with ADHD have much higher rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse. So I'll try to gather all this information and come up with some impressions and a plan, and then try to explain the plan to everybody in a way that hopefully makes sense to them. Sometimes I can do that in a single appointment. Sometimes that gets drawn out over several appointments. Part of it depends on if everybody's seeing things more or less the same way,
Right.
or I'm getting, 3 different opinions, where I then need to maybe gather information from outside sources.
So I gather, I like the idea that you're seeing more than just the person who shows up in your office. You're seeing them as a person who lives in a family, who lives in a culture, who lives in a body, who lives in all kinds of ways.
Right.
And what I also wonder is, where does sort of the psychodynamic interaction come in this model?
I mean, it varies. So I as a psychiatrist, I prescribe a lot of medicine, but I also provide therapy either directly with individuals, family therapy. I do group therapy. So part of what I'm looking at is trying to understand what's going on in the person's mind, at many different levels. How do they feel about their diagnosis? How do they feel about the treatments that I'm recommending? Trying to understand sort of how they got to be where they're at. And that includes the parents. So, for example, today I met with a mother of a 7-year-old. I had done the evaluation 6 months ago, recommended the child be on medicine for ADHD. They never started it. The mother had concerns about addiction. And so, part of we talked about today is, so, what do you mean by addiction? People use that word in different ways. What did it mean to her? What has changed that she's now wanting to start the medicine that I had originally recommended, 6 months ago, and they didn't do it then, and trying to understand those kinds of things. And part of her concerns were based on her own experience on medicine as a child, and kind of feeling desperate when she didn't have the medicine. And I pointed out to her, that's not addiction. That's recognizing that the medicine is being very helpful. I pointed out to her that I'm sure she felt the same way when she couldn't find her glasses. She happened to be wearing glasses. I went, it's the same thing. You have a problem and you have a good solution for it. When that solution's not available, you get upset. That's normal. That doesn't mean you're an addict. It just means that you there's something that's interfering with your solution. And so we talked about it. It made sense for her, and she seems now comfortable starting the medication for her child.
So you've been around a couple of years doing this work for a couple of more. Where does Freud live in our current zeitgeist of psychiatry? Where is Freud?
I think Freud still is influential, but I think not in the way that he has been portrayed in the movies or in popular culture, but really more in terms of a foundation that has gotten people to think in terms of dynamic things, to pay attention to what's going on in someone's head, to pay attention to the perceptions people have of their therapists, and how that influences their behavior, their willingness to be in therapy. Likewise, the therapist's perceptions of their patient and how that influences the way we interact, and that it's a mutual thing. And so I think Freud is very much alive, even if people don't necessarily teach or learn Freudian theory per se. So much of the modern psychodynamic, psychoanalytic thinking is strongly influenced by what he started.
Agreed. So I'm going to ask you one last question before I let you get back into that busy life of yours. What propelled you to seek out a profession in psychiatry?
It's interesting. I grew up in a family that sort of said, you're a good student, you're going to be either a doctor or a lawyer. I always had more interest in the sciences than arguing with people. And so I was going in that direction. And I went to summer camp, and first as a child, and then started working at this particular camp as a counselor. And I always found that I was drawn to the kids who had some difficulties, kids who had ADHD, but at least at that time, most kids stopped their medicine during the summer, or kids who had a phobia about swimming or those kinds of things. And to me, those were the most interesting kids to work with. And so I kind of really decided in late high school that I was going to be a child psychiatrist.
And you did.
Yeah.
And you did. The world is better for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Fink, I appreciate you taking your time today, and I look forward to hearing what you wind up doing next.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.